My mornings always started the same, a precise ritual honed over months of emptiness. The clatter of the kettle, the scrape of the spoon against the ceramic mug, the soft sigh of the coffee maker. Each sound was a dull echo in the small apartment, a constant reminder of the silence that had swallowed everything else. I moved through the motions, a ghost in my own life, the weight of what I'd done, what I'd lost, a lead shroud around my shoulders. I'd built that house. Every beam, every window frame, every precise measurement had been my handiwork. My family, my wife, my daughter, they had laughed and lived within those walls, walls I had designed, walls that ultimately failed them. The fire, the inferno that had consumed them, had been a brutal testament to my architectural hubris. I saw it still every time I closed my eyes. The orange glow against the night sky, the frantic shouts, the unbearable heat. The smoke, thick and acrid, clinging to my lungs even now, years later. Guilt was a living thing inside me, a parasite feeding on every breath. It had consumed my career, my friends, my will to simply be. One Tuesday, the routine fractured. A crisp envelope, far too formal for my current existence, waited in my mailbox. The paper felt heavy, expensive, smelling faintly of old money and dust. Inside, a letter from a legal firm I'd never heard of, tucked away in a remote part of the state. It spoke of an inheritance, an ancestral home, a distant relative I barely remembered who had apparently passed away without issue. My name was the only one on the will. I met the lawyer in a quiet, sterile office downtown. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, his eyes never quite meeting mine. He spoke in hushed tones about the estate, the property, the sheer isolation of the place. "It's been empty for decades, Raj," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "Needs a lot of work, more than a lot, to be frank." He slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany. Photographs, yellowed and faded, showed a sprawling, Gothic structure, half hidden by overgrown ivy and ancient trees. It looked less like a home and more like a forgotten sentinel. A shiver, not entirely from the air conditioning, traced its way down my spine. Why me? Why now? The lawyer couldn't say. Only that the will was explicit. The property was mine, free and clear, with a modest trust fund to cover initial repairs. A fresh start, he'd called it. A chance to escape the city, the whispers, the constant reminders. I didn't believe in fresh starts, but the idea of escape, of simply going, was a siren song I couldn't resist. Perhaps in that forgotten place, I could outrun the ghosts, or at least find a quiet corner for them to finally rest. The drive took 2 days. The trees here were older, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers reaching for a bruised sky. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, leaving the path in perpetual twilight. My old pickup, usually reliable, coughed and sputtered, as if protesting the journey, the destination. And then it appeared, the ancestral home. A broken wrought iron fence, rusted and leaning, marked the boundary of what must have once been a meticulously kept garden, now a wild tangle of thorny bushes and weeds. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just the distant, mournful sigh of the wind. I killed the engine. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my grip tight. Had I seen movement? A flicker, my heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy windows of the grand foyer. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the smell of mildew, decay, and something else. Something metallic, like old blood or perhaps just rust. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing unnaturally on the bare floorboards. Each creak, each groan of the settling house seemed amplified, purposeful. The house felt alive, in a way my own apartment never had. Not vibrant, but watchful. I found the kitchen before breakfast, knives accounted for mostly. The missing knives, I told myself, were probably just packed away, or perhaps lost to time. What kind of home had only some of its knives? And who would leave them like that? Each sound was a dull echo in the small apartment, a constant reminder of the silence that had swallowed everything. But the silence of the ancestral home was different. The wrought iron gates groaned a protest as I pushed them open, a sound like an old man clearing his throat, dry and reluctant. The gravel drive, choked with tenacious weeds, crunched under the tires of the rental van, a temporary beast of burden against the weight of my past. The house itself loomed, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised afternoon light. It was larger than I remembered from the faded photographs, more imposing, less welcoming. This was meant to be my sanctuary, my penance, a place where the ghosts of my mistakes might finally leave me be. The first few days were a blur of cardboard boxes and fine, pervasive dust. I dragged heavy canvas covers off furniture, revealing the ghosts of old upholstery, faded floral patterns clinging to their last threads. Each groan of the floorboards beneath my feet, each sigh of the wind through the eaves, I attributed to the house's sheer age, its vast, settling frame. I told myself it was the sound of wood expanding and contracting, of a structure breathing after years of neglect. My new morning ritual was less precise, more a clumsy dance with unfamiliar spaces. The kitchen, in particular, was a cavernous room, smelling faintly of damp earth and something metallic, like old pennies. The countertops were scarred with generations of use, the cupboards stiff, their hinges protesting every opening. I had spent an entire afternoon arranging the cutlery drawer, a small, desperate act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed my life. Each knife, each fork, each spoon placed just so, handles aligned, blades pointing the same direction. I needed order. I craved it, and this morning I was in the kitchen before breakfast, knives accounted for mostly, the phrase a silent mantra as I reached for the coffee filters, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth ceramic of the mug. I paused, listening. Nothing, just the dull thrum of the old refrigerator, a sound like a distant, tired heart. I turned to the sink, running the tap, letting the water warm to a tepid stream. When I turned back to the counter, the smallest paring knife, the one with the chipped wooden handle, lay askew, not just slightly off, but turned almost 90 degrees from where I'd placed it. My breath hitched, caught somewhere in my throat. I knew I had placed it perfectly. I always placed it perfectly. It was one of the few things I could control anymore, a small victory against the chaos that had swallowed everything else. My mind, ever the architect of logic, immediately sought an explanation. A vibration from the refrigerator, the house settling with a jolt, a draft from a poorly sealed window. I picked it up, the handle cool beneath my fingers, and turned it back into alignment with its brethren. A trick of the light, I decided, my eyes playing games in the dim morning. I poured the water into the kettle, the sound a comforting hiss, a small domestic reassurance. As I waited for it to boil, my gaze drifted to the wall opposite the sink. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. It was thin, like a finger had been dragged across the plaster, leaving a translucent residue. Not dirt, not dust. Something different. It caught the meager light filtering through the grimy window, reflecting it dully like dried oil or something more viscous, more organic. It had a subtle curve to it, an arc, as if tracing the outline of something unseen, something pressing against the wall, leaving a faint, greasy trace of its passage. My hand, still holding the empty kettle, trembled almost imperceptibly. I told myself it was old grime, finally revealing itself after years of neglect. The house was ancient after all, but the smear was too fresh, too deliberate in its shape. I took a hesitant step closer, my eyes narrowed, trying to discern its texture, its origin. Then a sound, not a creak, not a groan of old wood. A soft, almost imperceptible thump from the floor directly above me. It was too light to be a falling object, too deliberate to be the wind. It was a single, isolated sound, like a padded footfall, then nothing. A quiet so profound it felt like a presence. My head snapped up, my gaze fixed on the stained ceiling, trying to pierce the gloom to understand what I had heard. The kettle began to whistle, a sudden shrill shriek that made me jump, nearly dropping it, scalding water sloshing against the rim. I snatched the kettle off the burner, my heart racing, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet. My eyes darted around the kitchen, from the small, misaligned knife, now perfectly straight again, to the smear on the wall, still undeniably there, a silent accusation. Was I truly alone here, or was the house already breathing around me, watching, waiting? Who had left that mark on the wall, and what had made that sound just above my head, in a house I was supposed to be the only living occupant of? Might be. Was I losing my mind, just like they'd hinted at the support group? The next day, the unease deepened. I found a small, intricate silver locket on the bedside table. I hadn't brought it. I'd never seen it before. It lay there, gleaming dully in the morning light, utterly out of place amongst the scattered boxes and my own minimalist belongings. I picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight, a cold dread washing over me. Inside, there was no photo, just a faded, brittle lock of hair. Whose hair was it, and how had it appeared there? I spent an hour meticulously searching the room, checking every drawer, under every rug, peering into the dark corners of the wardrobe. Nothing. The locket was a solitary enigma, a tangible piece of the inexplicable that refused to fit into any logical framework. I placed it back on the table, convinced my grief was finally manifesting as hallucinations, or perhaps I was sleepwalking, scattering objects in my waking state. But the feeling that I was being watched, constantly, relentlessly, persisted, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Later that afternoon, while trying to clear some of the dust from the vast, unused library, I heard a faint, melancholic humming. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a lullaby sung through a veil of sorrow. I froze, dust cloth in hand, straining my ears. The sound painted shut with centuries of accumulated grime. I hammered on the glass with my fist, the impact sending dull aches through my knuckles, but the ancient pain held firm, unyielding. It was like trying to break through solid rock. The house was mocking my efforts, each attempt at escape met with an immovable, unseen barrier. There was this what Alara had felt, the absolute, crushing certainty of being trapped. The humming intensified, radiating from every wall, every floorboard, vibrating through the soles of my feet. It was no longer a growl, but a chorus of whispers, barely audible, yet undeniably present, forming a cacophony of distorted pleas and tormented cries. They were speaking to me or through me, dredging up images of the fire, the smoke, the desperate faces of my family. "Your fault, Raj," they hissed. "Your design, you trapped them." Each whisper was a fresh stab of guilt, a renewed surge of the sorrow that was this entity's lifeblood. I stumbled back, clutching my head, trying to block out the torment. My architectural eye, the one that saw flaws and weaknesses, was now seeing the house not as a structure, but as a vast, living maw, its very foundations built on the suffering of generations. The house wasn't just preventing my escape, it was actively trying to consume me. Peace, by the industrialist's words, had settled over me like a shroud woven from ice and ash. It didn't just witness grief. It consumed it, my grief. My crushing, suffocating grief, which had been the very reason I sought solace here, was now the bait. The horror wasn't some ancient spirit merely lurking in. It was a predator, and I was its prey, lured into a trap of my own making. I stood in the kitchen before breakfast, knives accounted for mostly, my fingers tracing the cool, worn edge of the countertop. The air smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, a scent I'd grown accustomed to in this house. A dull gleam caught my eye, the chef's knife, meticulously placed in its block, its blade reflecting the weak morning light. All of them were there, each one sharp and silent, except perhaps for the small paring knife I vaguely remembered seeing out on the cutting board yesterday, now gone. A flicker of unease, quickly dismissed. It was probably just tucked away in a drawer. My mind was on other things. My chest tightened with a cold, hollow ache that had nothing to do with hunger. It was the realization, stark and brutal, that my very being, my brokenness, was the fuel for this malevolence. The thought should have paralyzed me, but instead a cold fury began to simmer. Determination, sharp and unyielding, replaced the usual despair. I wouldn't be consumed. I wouldn't let it feed on me or anyone else. I had to understand, I had to fight. The industrialist, he knew, he was the key. I had to find him. Had to make him tell me everything. I didn't bother with coffee. The house felt different now, not just old and crumbling, but like a vast, hungry maw. I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt in years, a grim resolve burning in my gut. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The industrialist's estate was a short drive away, a sprawling property that always felt too quiet, too manicured. When I arrived, the gates were open. An unspoken invitation, or perhaps a challenge. I drove up the winding gravel path, the crunch of stones under my tires the only sound. His driver, a stoic man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, met me at the door. "The industrialist is expecting you, sir," he said, his voice flat. "He's in the sunroom." Expected me? Had he known I would come? The thought sent a fresh ripple of unease through me. The sunroom was bathed in a pale winter light. The industrialist seated in a high-backed armchair, a half-empty teacup on a small table beside him. He looked smaller, frailer than I remembered, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond age. His gaze, however, was still sharp, piercing. "Raj," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I knew you'd return. The house has a way of calling back those it has marked. You told me it feeds on grief," I began, my voice tight, cutting straight to it. "My grief. What else do you know? How does it do it?" He sighed, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. "It's not a spirit, not a ghost in the traditional sense. It's an echo, a malevolent resonance born from a specific kind of suffering, your family's suffering. My stomach clenched. My family? What are you talking about? The house, he continued, ignoring my interruption, it's built on a foundation of pain. Your ancestors, Raj. They were not merely architects, they were collectors of sorrow. They understood its power, its potential. He took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the glass walls. They didn't just design structures, they designed prisons for anguish, traps. Yes, they believed that concentrated grief, distilled and nurtured, could be harnessed. For what I never fully understood. But they built this house, your ancestral home, as their grandest experiment. A crucible for despair. His gaze finally met mine and there was a haunted look in his eyes. My own family, we were close to yours generations ago. We witnessed their descent, their obsession. We tried to warn them, but they were too far gone. All the generations of suffering. Precisely, he said, his voice barely audible. And it grows stronger with each new sorrow, each fresh wave of despair. It isn't just a presence, Raj, it's a living, breathing monument to accumulated anguish. And your family, your direct lineage, has always been its most potent source of sustenance. Your father, your grandfather, they were all broken by it in different ways, and now you, the fire that took your family, it was the perfect offering. A catastrophic loss, a crushing guilt. The entity must have gorged itself. The air in the sunroom seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. The industrialist's words painted a picture of something far more ancient and insidious than I had ever imagined, a generational curse woven into the very stones of my inherited home. My ancestors hadn't just built a house, they had built a living horror, a legacy of pain. And I, unknowingly, had walked right into it, carrying the heaviest burden of grief the entity could ever hope to consume. But if it's so powerful, I managed, my voice hoarse, why are you still here? It marks, it binds, and once you are marked, once it has tasted your grief, it never truly lets you go. It will always find a way to draw you back, to keep you close. It needs its food, and it prefers its food to be. He wasn't just an informant. He was another captive, another victim, another pawn. If what he said was true, if this entity truly bound its victims, then what chance did I have? How could I fight something that had already claimed generations of my family and now saw me as its next meal, already bound to its insidious hunger? The informant's words still scraped against the inside of my skull, a rusty echo of his terror. Another captive, another victim, another pawn. The air, even in what passed for the safety of my own room, felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me. If he was right, if this thing truly bound its victims, then what hope did I have? How could I fight something that held souls in thrall? I woke before dawn, the chill in the room far deeper than the winter air outside. My breath plumed in the dim light. I stumbled out of bed, my muscles stiff, and made my way downstairs. I found myself in the kitchen before breakfast, knives accounted for mostly. I ran my fingers over the cool, smooth handles of the block, counting them by touch. The chef's knife, the bread knife, the paring knife, all present. Steak knives in the drawer, the cleaver hanging from its hook. But the word mostly echoed in my head, a subtle dissonance. It wasn't that anything was overtly missing, but the feeling of completeness eluded me. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through my hand as I poured water into the kettle. The click of the gas igniting was a startlingly loud sound in the pre-dawn stillness. Gaunt eyes ringed with purple, a haunted stare. Guilt, a familiar friend, settled heavy in my gut. It was always there, a constant companion since the fire, since the loss of my family. This house, this entity, it fed on that. It thrived on my remorse, my self-blame. The informant's confession had been a brutal mirror, showing me that I wasn't just investigating, I was being harvested. A sudden sharp clang from the pantry made me flinch, sloshing hot water onto my hand. I hissed, pulling back. Nothing. Just an old pot, perhaps, settling on a shelf, or was it? It was trying to break me, to soften me, to make me an easier meal. But I wouldn't be, not anymore. I had run from my guilt for too long, built walls around it, tried to bury it under blueprints and new foundations. But it had followed me here, manifested itself in this decaying place. This wasn't just about escaping, it was about confronting. It was about ending this, one way or another. I would not be another pawn. I would not let this entity claim another soul, certainly not mine. This was my house, my legacy, my burden, and I would face it. My decision made, the kitchen suddenly felt too small, too mundane. The kettle whistled, a shrill, insistent sound. I ignored it. I needed to go deeper into the heart of this place where the entity truly resided. It was woven into the very fabric of the house, a parasite that had grown with the ancestral line. I moved from the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under my weight, each creak a complaint. The portraits on the walls, my ancestors, seemed to watch me with knowing, condemning eyes. Their faces, usually just faded oil on canvas, held a subtle shift, a hint of something malevolent in their painted smiles. This wasn't a physical descent into a basement. The entity wasn't hiding in a mundane storage space. It was something else. I felt drawn towards the oldest part of the house, the section that had been added onto, then built around over centuries. The original stone core, the hallway narrowed, the ceiling pressing lower. The wallpaper, peeling in long, damp strips, seemed to writhe in the flickering light of my phone's torch. The smell here was different, not just dust and decay, but something metallic like old blood, and something else, cloying and sweet like wilting lilies. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. I pushed open a heavy, unadorned wooden door I'd never noticed before, tucked away behind a built-in bookshelf that had always seemed immovable. The hinges shrieked, a sound like tortured metal. Beyond lay a short, winding passage, sloping downwards. The walls here were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. The air grew thick, pressing in on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The passage opened into a circular chamber, carved deep into the earth beneath the house. No windows, no discernible light source other than my phone. The walls were covered in intricate, swirling carvings, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. They weren't decorative, they were glyphs, symbols, ancient and unsettling. And on the altar, laid out like an offering, was a single charred wooden beam. It wasn't just any beam. It was a piece of my old home. I recognized the grain, the way the fire had eaten into it, leaving behind a skeletal pattern. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just a chamber, it was a shrine to my pain. Then I saw it. Etched into the stone surface of the altar beneath the charred beam was a crude, childlike drawing. A house burning, and within its walls 3 stick figures, my family, my wife, my son, my daughter. It wasn't just feeding on my grief, it was celebrating it. It had been there, watching, perhaps even orchestrating. This was the ultimate manifestation of my guilt. The entity hadn't just found my trauma, it had been waiting for it. It had drawn me here, lured me with the promise of inheritance, knowing my past would follow. This chamber, this altar, was not just a part of the house, it was the mechanism, the engine of its power. The carvings on the wall, I realized with a sickening jolt, were not random. They were conduits. They were anchors. My hands trembled, the phone almost slipping from my grasp. A low hum vibrated through the stone floor, a sound I felt more than heard. It was alive. The entity was here, its presence palpable, heavy, suffocating. It had been waiting for me to find this place, to see its work, to understand. What did it want me to do now that I knew? If he was right, if this thing truly bound its victims, then the house wasn't just a dwelling, it was a cage. And I, Raj, was its architect. I stood in the kitchen before breakfast, the pre-dawn gloom clinging to the windows. A thin, cold light filtered through the panes, painting the familiar space in shades of bruised purple and gray. My breath plumed in the frigid air. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly as I ran them over the butcher block. I was checking, double-checking, that the knives accounted for mostly were still in their slots. The chef's knife, the serrated bread knife, the paring knife, all present. I hadn't used it in weeks. My stomach clenched. This wasn't just a house. It was a blueprint of my own undoing, every joist and beam saturated with the grief I had brought, the guilt I carried. But an architect understood structure. An architect understood points of failure. And an architect could, if necessary, redesign a prison. My gaze swept over the kitchen, noting the sturdy oak table, the worn floorboards, the heavy pantry door. Each element, each material, had a purpose in my mind. I wasn't just seeing a room, I was seeing a system, a series of interconnected spaces, a potential circuit. The informant had spoken of binding. What did that mean architecturally? A containment field, a conduit. I needed to understand its mechanism. My plan had formed in the long, sleepless hours of the night, a desperate gamble born of architectural logic and raw, burning resolve. This house, I now understood, was a grand, terrible design itself. A faint, sweet smell like damp earth and decaying leaves began to permeate the kitchen. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, then it intensified, clinging to the back of my throat. My skin prickled. I knew this scent. It was the entity's breath. I had identified the core, not a specific room but a convergence point, a nexus of the house's sorrow, deep in the foundations, below the main hall. A place where the family's legacy of grief had truly settled. A structural fault line in the very fabric of existence. My ancestors hadn't built a home, they had built a vault, and then they had sealed themselves inside with whatever they had meant to contain, or perhaps what they had created. My eyes darted to the doorway, my hand instinctively reaching for the large chef's knife. The sound didn't repeat. I gripped the knife tighter, its cool steel a tiny comfort against my sweating palm. This wasn't about fighting it with a blade, not really. This was about focus, about the tangible reality of a weapon in a world that was becoming increasingly unreal. My strategy was not one of brute force, but of spatial manipulation, of leveraging the house's own geometry against the thing that infested it. I had studied the original blueprints, the subtle alterations over generations. The house wasn't just old, it was layered. A low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a resonance that went beyond sound, stirring something deep in my bones. It felt like the house itself was waking, not gently, but with a slow, grinding groan. The light from the kitchen window flickered, though there was no breeze, no storm outside. Just the deepening, unnatural gloom within these walls. Was it a distraction, a warning, or something else entirely? The lingering taste of ash and something metallic, coppery, clung to my tongue. It wasn't a memory of the fire, it was new, real. I was in the kitchen before breakfast. Knives accounted for mostly. The pale morning light, usually a gentle balm, felt harsh, exposing every scratch, every fissure in the ancient plaster. My breath hitched with each movement, ribs aching, a deep bruise blossoming across my sternum where something unseen had slammed into me. I remembered the cold, the suffocating pressure, the frantic clawing at the air. It had been like drowning in solid rock. The silence was the loudest sound. Not the usual creaks and groans of an old house waking, but a hollow, wounded quiet. It felt as if the very timbers had screamed. I dragged myself to the counter, the cool ceramic a small comfort against my burning cheek. My gaze swept across the array of kitchen tools. The carving knives, the paring blades, the cleaver all lay in their wooden block, glinting innocently, mostly accounted for. My eyes snagged on the empty slot, the one where the long, serrated bread knife usually rested. Had it always been empty? I couldn't remember. My mind raced, skipping over the details of the past hours. It had sought my despair, craving the bitterness of my guilt. I had pushed back, fueled by something I hadn't known. I possessed a raw, desperate will to live, to not be another captive, another pawn. But what had I actually done? What had I truly faced? I could hear the house groaning, not settling, but recoiling. A deep, resonant thrumming vibrated through the floorboards, a sound like a vast, unseen organ chord dying away. I knew then that the house was scarred, not just structurally, but profoundly. What had it cost the house to endure this struggle? I ran a hand over my stubbled chin, feeling the grit of dust, tasting the metallic tang again. Where had it come from? I couldn't recall anything physical like this during the struggle. Had I touched the entity? Every muscle in my body protested, screaming for rest, but my mind was too agitated. I needed to see. I needed to understand the extent of the damage. I pushed away from the counter, my legs shaky, each step a deliberate effort. The hallway was a mosaic of shattered plaster and splintered wood. Moonlight, or what was left of it, filtered through a gaping hole in the outer wall, where a window had once been. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere upstairs, and the incessant, soft tick-tick-tick of something else, something small. My eyes narrowed, straining to identify the source. It was coming from the floor near the threshold of the living room. As I edged closer, my breath catching in my throat, I saw it. A trail, not footprints, but a series of tiny metallic scuffs, leading from the shattered living room door across the hallway and then stopping abruptly at the base of the staircase. They looked like minuscule claw marks, too precise for random debris. They were too regular, it leaves a mark. Had these tiny scratches been left by a struggling captive, or by something else, something that had been drawn out during the fight? I took another step, my foot crunching on plaster dust. The faint tick-tick-tick sound intensified, seemingly emanating from the end of the hall near the study door. My study, the one I had painstakingly renovated, the one where I had felt a fleeting sense of peace. A knot tightened in my gut. The house was not just scarred, it was fundamentally altered, a map of the battle etched onto its very being. But if the entity had been driven back, why did these marks remain? What had truly happened in those desperate moments, and what had been left behind in its wake? Real. The pale morning light, usually a gentle balm, felt harsh, exposing every scratch, every fissure in the ancient butcher block, the grimy grout of the floor tiles. My fingers brushed the cool steel of the chef's knife, then the serrated bread knife, the paring knife. All present, all accounted for. Yet the small, slender boning knife, with its distinctive curve, was gone from the block. A small, insignificant detail. It wasn't there. My breath hitched, a shallow, rattling sound in the quiet room. The air was still, heavy with the scent of stale cooking oil and something else, something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit, but with an underlying sharpness that pricked at my sinuses. I scanned the countertops, the drained drying rack, the open drawers. Nothing, just an empty slot in the wooden block. It was a pinprick of unease, a familiar shadow in the periphery of a mind determined to find peace. I pulled out a chair, the scrape of wood on tile echoing unnaturally loud. My gaze drifted to the pantry door, then the back door, and finally, the window overlooking the overgrown garden. Each frame seemed to hold a memory, a flicker of something seen or imagined. The house was quiet, too quiet. No creaks of settling wood, no distant rumble of traffic, just the soft, insistent hum of my own pulse in my ears. The entity had receded, or perhaps it was simply waiting. I understood now. It never truly left. It merely allowed a lull. The last few days had been a blur of revelations, of peeling back layers of a history I never wanted to claim. My family, their architectural legacy, not just buildings, but carefully constructed prisons for suffering, designed to hold and amplify the misery of those within, feeding some insatiable hunger. And my guilt, my profound, consuming guilt over that fire, had been an open invitation, a banquet spread before a starving beast. I had walked into its jaws willingly, unknowingly. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn oak of the kitchen table. The grain felt cold, unyielding. I used to think the house was merely old, dilapidated. Now I saw it as a living archive, a monument to a terrible ingenuity. It was built to sing a dirge, to amplify the human heart's most discordant notes. I couldn't burn it, not again. The thought had been my first, primal instinct after the truth had fully sunk in. To reduce it to ash, to purge the rot with fire, just as fire had purged so much from my own life. But the memory of the acrid smoke, the searing heat, the screams, those were mine to carry. And this house, I realized, wasn't just a structure, it was a symptom. Destroying it would be like amputating a limb while the disease still raged through the body. The entity would merely find another host, another place where grief and guilt lay dormant, waiting to be stirred. The entity wasn't some external demon that possessed the house. It was the house, or rather, the malevolent echo of generations of my family's architectural cruelty, given form by the very materials they chose. It was the collected weight of all the sorrow it had witnessed, all the despair it had consumed, solidified into something hungry and aware. And my family, my ancestors, were the unwitting or perhaps willing architects of its being. They didn't just design buildings, they designed pain. The boning knife. Its absence niggled at me, a small, sharp point of worry. I pushed it away. This wasn't about another frantic search for a missing object. This was about a decision. I traced a pattern on the table with my finger, feeling the slight ridges and grooves. To leave would be to condemn others. To stay would be to live perpetually on the edge of a precipice, always aware of the unseen eyes, the waiting hunger. But what if staying wasn't about being a victim? What if it was about being an architect once more, not of structures that amplified misery, but of a cage, a containment? I would not succumb, I would not flee, I would become the final architect of this legacy. My hands, once trembling with fear, now felt a strange steadiness. My heart still beat a frantic rhythm, but it was no longer solely fear. It was a determination sharp as the blade of a knife. I stood up, pushing the chair back into place with a soft thud. The pale morning light still felt harsh, but I no longer flinched from it. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the faint sheen on the ancient tiles, the empty slot in the knife block. I would study the house, its true blueprints, its hidden mechanics of malevolence. I would understand its language of despair. But how do you seal a wound that is the very fabric of existence, and what does it truly mean to contain something that feeds on the essence of sorrow itself?